Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator, and today I'm going to be reviewing, critiquing a conversation slash debate, got a little bit heated at times, between Graham Hancock on the one hand and Dr. Flint Dibble on the other hand. Now, this is something that I feel like personally has been in the works for a long time. Maybe it's just because I'm connected to the archaeological community, Big Archaeology. Big Archaeology, by the way, funded this episode. So shout out. I'm just kidding. Because of the whole conspiratorial thing. Anyway, dumb joke. So yeah, I am, I guess I should say, kind of connected to the archaeological community. I'm connected with a handful of archaeologists. And so I feel like this conversation has been floating around in internet culture for quite some time, trying to get an archaeologist on the Joe Rogan Experience to talk with Graham Hancock. Now, Graham Hancock probably doesn't really need an introduction by this point. He's been on the Joe Rogan Experience quite a few times. Joe Rogan Experience, of course, the biggest podcast out there. And Hancock is, along with people like Randall Carlson, are frequent guests who are supporting what people in the archaeological community would call pseudo archaeology or alternative history. So there's been this big push to get an actual archaeologist on there, and Flint Dibble is, of course, Dr. Flint Dibble is, of course, an actual archaeologist. So this is something that's been hyped up, at least for me, and I'm glad to see that it actually happened. So what I'm going to be focusing on here, because my background, of course, is not in archaeology and it's not in ancient history. I'm very much so a student of both of those disciplines. Sometimes I'm required to teach ancient history. It's a little daunting to be required to do that. So I try to keep as up to date as is feasible for me. But my research interest, of course, is in more modern history, the history of science. So the focus of this review specifically is not so much going to be on the content of what's being talked about, but more so on the form of the arguments that are being presented from both sides, both Hancock and Dr. Dibble here. But before we get into that, if you are interested in the content, let me throw out a few recommendations. These recommendations were actually mentioned during the podcast. I'm going to go ahead and start by throwing out two of my favorite people. The first is Dr. Bill Farley. Bill's actually been on my channel. I've interviewed Bill before. I'll post the link to that conversation in the description of this video. Bill is a fantastic archaeologist. As you can see, he's also made a few videos on Hancock's show, Ancient Apocalypse, reviewing the show. Really awesome channel with a lot of great videos exploring primarily North American archaeology, but also one of my favorite interests, archaeogaming, the connection between archaeology and video games. Really cool stuff. The other channel I want to shout out is History with Kayleigh. Another fantastic channels covering a lot of ancient history specifically. And as you can see here, she also has some videos on Hancock and the claims that he made specifically more recently in Ancient Apocalypse as well. I really like the series on hominids that Kayleigh has. Fantastic channel. I'll post a link to both of those channels in the description of this video. Again, in terms of content, those are the people that you definitely want to check out there. So really quickly, because the episode starts with Dr. Dibble's critique of Hancock. Now, if you're not familiar with Hancock's argument, I just want to give a brief overview of the sorts of claims that he makes. The focus in this conversation specifically tends to center on Hancock's claim for a lost civilization and the sort of argument or non-argument, as we'll see later in this video, that he presents for a lost civilization. So broadly speaking, Hancock argues that there was a highly advanced civilization predating recorded history that's like prior to roughly 12,000 years ago, prior to the traditional start of civilization. Dr. Dibble presents some complications with how we start things like civilization and what exactly terms like civilization means. Different conversation for a different time. But generally speaking, if you pick up like a world history textbook from your local high school or local college, you're going to have this idea of the Neolithic Revolution that starts roughly 12,000 years ago. Hancock's view is based on archaeological anomalies. Hancock's contention is that civilization predates the Neolithic revolution. So the timeline that's commonly pushed by those history and archaeology textbooks is fundamentally wrong. Hancock's view is based on archaeological anomalies like the Great Sphinx, ancient megalithic structures, and similarities in mythologies. And another thing that he brings up in this conversation is knowledge of disciplines like astronomy specifically. He suggests that civilization was wiped out by a cataclysmic event, possibly around the end of the late Ice Age, that wiped out, that got rid of this civilization, and along with it, got rid of all of the remnants of the civilization, and that its remnants, its remains, just survived, sort of intellectually speaking, in the later civilizations that developed. And the other aspect to this argument is that the existence of this Ice Age civilization or pre-Neolithic revolution civilization, lost civilization, we'll just stick with lost civilization, that the existence of this lost civilization is largely dismissed by the mainstream archaeological community, that no one's really taking this seriously. And then on top of that, there's a conspiratorial element to this. Now, Hancock really strongly pushes against this narrative in the conversation and the debate that happens. But the idea is that not necessarily that it's being covered up by mainstream archaeology, but that they just don't want to hear it, and that anybody who proposes it or suggests it is kind of blacklisted or exiled from the community, that it's intentionally shut down. So that's the general argument claim that Hancock's presenting. Now, if you feel like I've misrepresented that, feel free to tell me that in the comment section below. But this is what Dibble is responding to. And so let's go ahead and get into Dibble's critique.
The whole point here is that archaeology is not really about an artifact. It's not about a monument. It's about our patterns. And so when we sort of look at how much archaeology there is in the world, this is a map that shows the Horn of Africa with every single archaeological site that's been surveyed there. And there's 171,000 of them.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It just looks amazing.
It's just, and this is just because of the terrain. Many of these are tombs, for example, Islamic and pre-Islamic tombs. And so they're visible on the surface. And so in many ways, when we think about archaeology today in the 21st century, we're thinking about big data sets and trying to analyze them statistically and understand the kind of patterns they put together. And we use innovative technology, sort of LiDAR, lasers from the sky to see these things underground. For example, here are this publication by Canuto in 2018 records 61,480 structures still to be excavated, found with LiDAR and surface survey.
Okay, so I played this clip specifically because in terms of the form of the argument that Dr. Dibble's presenting, I think this is a crucial point that he's making that is fundamentally overlooked by Hancock, and that is often overlooked by a lot of proponents or supporters of alternative history. And this is a point about the methodology of archaeology. And what Dibble is saying here is that archaeology, much like other scientific and historical disciplines, I like to think of this structured like a pyramid. At the base of this pyramid is what we'll call archaeological evidence. So what Dibble is saying is that from these thousands of archaeological sites, each one of which has been excavated, there's been a countless number of artifacts taken from each one of these small sites, that in terms of developing archaeological theories or archaeological hypothesis, that what a theory or hypothesis is doing in this situation is an attempt to explain or to make sense of all of the data that we have. So we have these thousands of sites which have been excavated. On top of that, we have other thousands of sites that have been detected by things like LiDAR, geographical survey. So we are aware of these sites, even if they haven't necessarily been excavated by people individually. We're aware that they exist, where they're at, and that it is in observing these patterns that archaeologists come to their ideas and come to their hypothesis about the bigger implications of what each one of these individual sites means. Now, this is really interesting, and I bring this up because, as we'll see a bit later on, Hancock actually does the opposite of that methodology. And this is where a lot of the contention comes in. And I'll explore that a little bit more later, but I just wanted to start here and point that out. Now, the next clip I'm going to show, Dr. Dibble presents some direct objections to Hancock's theory of a lost civilization. So I'm going to go ahead and play that.
That's kind of my goal here while here. And so I'm here to doing a lot of research. I'm here to present what I see are two clear disproofs of a lost advanced ice age civilization. And I mean, archaeologists were fairly sure this does not exist. We've been looking for this kind of civilization for several hundred years. This idea of a pre-flood civilization has been around for several hundred years. And so what I want to do is focus on where my own experience and expertise is. My dad was an ice age archaeologist. He studied Neanderthal caves. And so I want to dig into some of the stuff that he's excavated and surveyed. These are, for example, 100,000-year-old stone tools from Egypt. And so we have just so much ice age evidence, and Graham usually ignores it.
So just to summarize here, because there's some technical issues that happen that I think everybody who professionally presents stuff can absolutely relate to. The battle of the HDMI cord. So Dr. Dibble presents two fundamental critiques to Hancock's position. And these 2 points are major pieces of evidence which would lead to the opposite conclusion that Hancock is suggesting. In other words, this evidence gives us a pretty, I don't want to say clear, but this evidence gives us a picture of what human culture and human existence looked like during the period that Hancock is suggesting that this lost civilization existed. And I would encourage you, if you haven't seen the conversation, I'm not going to cover in detail the evidence that Dr. Dibble presents. He does a fantastic job of walking through it and talking about the various ice age sites, as well as presenting his case and understanding for food domestication. But in terms of the structure of the argument, what Dr. Dibble's suggesting is that we have these thousands of ice age sites that we've excavated, that we've surveyed. And from all of those sites, we start to get a picture of what life during that time looked like. Furthermore, we have very clear evidence of when the domestication of plants happened, a rough timeline for when the domestication of certain plants were happening and where that domestication was happening. And this is a challenge to Hancock's view, because Hancock's arguing for this lost major civilization that existed. And so the question is, what was their food supply? Because generally speaking, if we're talking about the existence of a society that size, they would have had to have had a regular and steady food supply almost, always. This comes in the form of agriculture, but we know that they didn't have domesticated agriculture. A similar objection was raised by Michael Shermer in terms of metallurgy and metalworking. We can tell due to core samples that were taken from places like Antarctica when human beings started to smelt metal due to, I'm not scientific reasons. I'm not, again, not my background, but we can see through empirical data when this started to happen. And we know that it didn't happen before this time period. So what sort of materials were they using if they weren't using metal? Now, Hancock suggests that they might be using some other sort of material. Well, okay, then this is why Dr. Dibble is focusing on the food source then. Well, okay, well, where are they getting their food? So that's the objection. Let's get into Hancock's response to these big objections.
I'm going to try and recall a few of your questions. The lost civilization that I'm thinking of is like a black hole in space to me. It's like something missing in the story of our past. To the extent that I can put form on it, I think we're looking at a civilization like all civilizations that emerged out of shamanism. I believe that they did have rather advanced astronomy and a knowledge of the world, but I don't compare. When I speak of a 19th century level of technology, I'm talking specifically about knowledge of longitude. The longitude problem was not solved by our civilization until the middle of the 18th century. And I'm talking about knowledge of very hard to observe astronomical phenomena such as the precession of the equinoxes. That knowledge is normally attributed to the ancient Greeks.
Okay, so Hancock's response to Dr. Dibble is really to start off by pivoting a little bit and claiming that he's really talking about more intellectual influence in the form of astronomical knowledge, shifting away from a more material influence. So it's not necessarily that this lost civilization gave these other societies like physical technology, more so that they gave them more intellectual influence. But the fact still remains that if that civilization physically existed, they would have left behind some physical remains. And this is Dr. Dibble's big pushback. The objection is that based on the physical remains that we do have of these ice age sites, that there's no reason to believe that this advanced civilization existed, because again, we have a pretty good idea of what sort of culture they had. I don't want to put words in Hancock's mouth, so let's get back to Hancock's response about why haven't we found these material remains then?
Look, there's the Sahara Desert. A fair bit of archaeology has been done in the Sahara Desert, but we're looking at 9.2 million square kilometers of the Sahara Desert. Tell me how much of the Sahara you think has actually been excavated, Flint, by archaeologists?
I'd say a bunch of it has been surveyed, including by my dad.
No. How much has actually been excavated? What sort of percent do you
Well,
have
a
in
lot
mind?
of sort of desert archaeology does not have excavation. It's eroded away due to the wind.
Oh, so
And
what's
so-
your answer to my question? How much does archaeology really know about the past of the Sahara?
Well, we understand about the domestication of pearl millet in the Sahara, from when the Sahara was a much of it was actually more habitable because it was not desert. So we can see the domestication of pearl millet and sorghum.
No.
We can see
My
ice
question
age
is
sites
my
across
question
it.
is related specifically to my subject. Has enough of the Sahara been excavated for archaeology to exclude any possibility that they've missed anything important in the Sahara?
We have found thousands of sites of ephemeral hunter-gatherer remains in the Sahara.
You're still not answering my question. How much of the Sahara has archaeology actually looked at?
I have no idea, but quite a bit, Graham.
What do you mean by quite a bit?
What I mean is that due to remote sensing, due to surface survey, and due to archaeological excavation, we actually have reasonable coverage across the Sahara. We understand that during green periods in the Neolithic, we can see agricultural villages, and before the Neolithic, we can find ephemeral hunter-gatherer camps where they were napping stones.
But the fact of the matter is, around about 1% of the Sahara has been excavated, and 99% hasn't. So to say that there's no possibility of any traces of a lost civilization in the Sahara seems to me a bit premature, particularly since during the African humid period, and there were several of them, the Sahara was green and fertile, and was a very attractive environment in which to live.
Okay, so Hancock's basic rebuttal here is focusing specifically on the Sahara, is that, well, how much has been excavated? He kind of pushes Dr. Dibble on this point and says, well, less than 1% has been excavated, so we can't really rule out that we would not be able to find a lost civilization in the Sahara. He makes very similar claims a little bit later on, so I'm going to skip ahead a bit. This is about to the hour and 5-minute mark if you want to kind of follow along yourself with the original video.
A lot more. I'm simply raising this to address Flint's apparent point that archaeology has done enough already to rule out the possibility of a lost civilization. That's certainly what's said in the SAA's letter to Netflix.
And Flint, what is your position on that, specifically with what he's talking about South America, that South America would be a place where an advanced civilization would thrive because it wouldn't, during the Ice Age time, because it wouldn't be experiencing the brutal cold that Northern Europe had?
No, but I still think we'd want to find some sort of evidence of things like agriculture, right? And so we can look at the development of agriculture in South America and in Mesoamerica. I have slides on that. And we can see that we can see the transition from wild to domestic in real space and time.
That we're going to find hunter-gatherer sites underwater. I'm simply saying, and you seem to keep evading this issue, that not enough has been done to rule out the possibility of a lost civilization. There were hunter-gatherers all over the world during the Ice Age, and of course we're going to find hunter-gatherer sites underwater. But to say that we've done enough underwater archaeology to rule out the possibility that something very surprising might be found underwater, to me is actually dishonest to rule out the possibility. I'm not saying that we're not going to find hunter-gatherer sites. Of course we are. But I'm saying that for archaeology to claim and to quite viciously and unpleasantly attack me for suggesting the possibility that there might be a lost civilization, to make that claim while having failed thus far to investigate thoroughly the vast areas of the submerged continental shelves, the vast areas of the Amazon rainforest, the vast areas of the Sahara Desert that have not been investigated, that claim is premature and that claim is disingenuous.
Okay, so I highlight those clips specifically to illustrate the point that I made at the beginning of this video, which is that there is a distinct methodological difference between how Dr. Dibble is approaching and interpreting the past and how Hancock is approaching and interpreting the past. For Dr. Dibble, the explanations that he's providing is based on thousands of excavated sites, geographical information, imaging technology, building up from that data and developing a picture about what the ancient world looked like based on sort of where the data is pointing. Hancock is doing the opposite. Hancock is looking at the absence of data and theorizing about what that data cannot explain or what we're missing in our data. So I bring this up because a fundamental aspect of Hancock's argument hinges upon a logical fallacy. And that logical fallacy is what we call in critical thinking an argument from ignorance. So traditionally speaking, an argument from ignorance is an informal logical fallacy that occurs when someone asserts the validity or the truthfulness of a proposition based on an absence of evidence or based on the fact that something has not been proven true. Or you could also say it also occurs when somebody bases an argument on the fact that something has not been disproven. So either way, a proposition is true because it's not been proven false, or a proposition is false because it's not been proven true. And this is a fallacy because in informal logic and critical thinking and everyday conversation, the likelihood that a proposition is true directly corresponds to the evidence that we have to support that proposition. So I'm talking in terms of propositions and validity, but think of any everyday ordinary example, right? So an example I like to give in my previous videos on critical thinking is I have a friend named Josh. I'm expecting Josh to come over to my house at 10 a.m. I hear a knock on my door at 10 a.m. Who could be at my door? Well, in that scenario, it would be I would have evidence to suggest that the person at my door is Josh, because maybe we've texted before, maybe we've called each other before, maybe Josh told me in person that he was coming over to my house the next day at 10 a.m. I have good reason to believe that it's Josh. Now, this is a form of reasoning that we call inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, there's always a small chance that it could be wrong. It could be somebody else at my door, as I'm sure you could imagine, or come up with different scenarios. But the point here is that in terms of beliefs that we have, those beliefs are justified or not justified based on the amount of evidence that we have to support those beliefs. And it's no different even when you're dealing with academic disciplines such as science, archaeology, history, whatever it is. How much evidence do we have to support that belief that leads to the validity of the hypothesis or the validity of the theory? So here we have a modified version of the argument from ignorance that's being used by Hancock, where a lack of or no evidence is used as a justification for a proposition, a justification for the theory of the lost civilization. So in this case, we have Hancock asserting that the truth or the probability of the claim that there was a lost civilization is based on an absence of evidence. It's based on the fact that we haven't explored these areas, that we've explored very little of places like the Sahara or the Amazon. But to be clear, and Flint's entire point, there's no direct evidence to support any of these ideas. The fact that we have not thoroughly explored these regions does not lend any sort of validity to the claim that there might be a lost civilization here. We simply are left with, if somebody asks us, do you think there should be a lost civilization? We don't know. But on top of that, on top of we don't know, the evidence that we do have seems to be pointing to the opposite conclusion. But again, we're dealing with probability here. We're not dealing with deductive arguments. And one of Dr. Dibble's big claims here by bringing up Carl Sagan, I think, is that the truth or falsity of a claim directly corresponds to the available evidence that we have to support that claim. So Hancock's argument for a lost civilization commits this fallacy because it's relying on gaps in our understanding of the past in order to posit or in order to lend credibility to its believability. So the fact that we have these gaps, and this is sort of the position that Hancock is arguing for, because we have these gaps, it's reasonable to assume that there's a lost civilization. And that's a classic argument from ignorance. Instead of providing affirmative evidence, which is what you would need to do in this situation, instead of providing affirmative evidence for a lost civilization, we are instead relying upon these gaps in our knowledge. The fallacy is that the absence of evidence does not necessarily indicate the truth or the believability of the claim. So ultimately, the problem boils down to two sort of methodological points. The first is that Dr. Dibble provided good explanations of the data, presented a good outline of the data and suggestion of where the data is leading us, theories which make sense of that data. And two, ultimately, archaeological, historical, scientific theories need to rest on positive evidence in favor of a hypothesis or in favor of a theory. Now, there's a distinction between hypothesis and theory, different video for a different day, and does not need to rely on negative evidence against an accepted theory. So it's not enough to attempt to poke holes in an alternative hypothesis. You need to provide an alternative suggestion. And Hancock's alternative suggestion is that there's a lost civilization, but your alternative suggestion likewise needs evidence to support it. And on that note, to close out the video, I'm actually going to leave us with the words of Hancock himself.
But can we say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied?
In what they have studied, yes, we can say there's no evidence
Yeah.
for an advanced civilization.